if you were to draft the disappointing stories in the NBA so far this season, who would go where? I mean, how many could you go? I don't want to make it so negative that it's like, all right, pick number 27 is, right? Because that's not true, because there's a lot of great stories. The East is awesome. Philly figuring things out. Them losing Chicago last night almost felt like it was due. Double overtime, they lose and beat foul trouble. So that's not that big of a deal. We've talked about the depth. We've talked about the scoring stuff. But if you just go by kind of team and maybe even player, but it feels a little bit more team related, what would be the number one pick for the most disappointing storyline? This feels a bit like when you played fantasy basketball with Shaq in his prime. If you did do that it was like, oh, you get the number one pick. Like, this isn't even going to be fair because then you get this dude that gets these absurd numbers. Again, wasn't super locked into fantasy, but I just remember that being a thing. I don't think there's any other pick besides the New Orleans Pelicans. And it's not just this season. It's not them collapsing. It's not just the Zion thing, but it's also the Zion thing in the future. This is kind of everything. And this is a Pelicans team that I've said numerous times this season, as the Clippers were, sometimes it's just a recency bias of like, hey, they added John Wall. Like, that was the most recent thing. So now that's the deepest roster. And the John Wall thing did not work out. But there was an argument about the Clippers having the most talent on the roster, 1 through 9, 1 through 10, whatever you want to say. And I felt like it was definitely the Pelicans. And even without Zion, this talented roster that I believe is still in place in New Orleans, because it is, they're a mess. So if you look at where they're at now, they're a 12 seed today. So this team might not even make the playoffs. So much for my most talented roster thing. I'm willing to accept criticism for that, is what I'm telling you. They were 23-12. Zion goes out 2 games later in that game against Philadelphia where he pulls up with the hamstring. We had heard Zion would be reevaluated in a couple weeks. That was a couple weeks ago. So the most recent thing was hope that he would be back for the playoffs. So since that 23-12 start, they've gone 11-25. They're 26th in offense. They're 17th in defense. They are better than only 3 teams since January 2nd as far as total wins. More wins than only Houston, San Antonio, and Detroit. Probably figure out what those 3 squads are doing. Brandon Ingram's been back for 2 months now. Murphy's had a really good month. Valanciunas. So there's enough talent, I would have thought, to not be this bad. You're not going to be the same without Zion, but 11-25, potentially out of the playoffs. It's really frustrating for what I think is a front office and coaching staff that looked like this team had turned the corner, figured it out, had a bunch of options, had vets now, younger lottery picks for later. They still have the picks coming in from previous trades. Like, there was a lot to feel really good about with this Pelicans team. And it's not disappointment that they're not going to be a top 4 seed or contend or come out of the West, which were all some of these weird possibilities we were thinking about, much like we were thinking about with Sacramento now. And when we talked about Sacramento for 20-something minutes on one of the Sunday pods to open it up, we could have just simplified the whole thing by saying, and they've actually just been way healthier than everyone else, which feels like it diminishes them. But if you're healthy and ready to go, as opposed to all these teams that have all these question marks, that's not your fault if you're the Kings. But for the Pelicans, I don't think there's any other pick, because even without Zion, they shouldn't be this bad. They shouldn't only have more wins since he's gone out again than Houston, San Antonio, and Detroit. So if there were a number one pick for disappointing storylines, I don't know what else you would pick. Other potential picks on the board, I don't know if it's a Minnesota thing. And by the way, I just want to jump back to the Zion thing. Depending on how the Zion story goes for this year, now you're faced with like some real hard questions about the future of Zion with this basketball team. And I know we did it this year. There's past off season when we had Dave Griffin on, we talked about the contract. He basically told us on the podcast, we will do the deal, but we need protections. That's exactly what he had. And Zion got his money, but there was some protection if he wasn't going to play. But this is an ongoing thing where you have to kind of ask yourself this question. And granted, most of the teams will never trade the guy like this because they figure even if we traded him, what would you really get back? We get enough that's even close to what is a version of him when he's healthy. But if it doesn't work out that he's healthy again, and I know I kind of jumped back to the first pick, but that's why it's the first pick. It's years out planning of what you're hoping to be as a franchise, because this dude who hasn't even really had to learn how to play basketball yet is still this dominant when he's playing. All right, so back to Minnesota being on the board here. If you didn't remember, last year Minnesota actually finished 46-36. They went to 6 games in the 2-7 matchup against Memphis. It was kind of a fun series. Right now, they're sitting at 36 and 37. Yes, they've had some injuries. Edwards and potentially Karl Anthony Towns coming back Wednesday against Atlanta. Towns has been out since November 28th. But it really speaks to the Gobert trade. And some of this may feel a little unfair for Gobert because he's not the one who traded him for himself. And he's had a really nice March. But if you look at all the numbers across the board, and this is the other part about Gobert, not only what you gave up for him, but that he was aging, he was showing some kind of decline, and the declines continued. The rebounding rate is way down. The blocks are the lowest since his rookie year. There's some metrics across the board that just tell you that he's not exactly the same kind of guy. Some metrics would be unfair to judge him on because Utah was just a much better basketball team, despite not having playoff success. That Utah team put together a few seasons in a row there where they were one of the best teams in the league, at least in the regular season. But the problem for this is that you're not any better, and you're projected to be worse than you were last season. Now, you can blame it all on the Towns injury, him not being there, them trying to figure out the D'Angelo Russell thing and bringing in a version of Conley. That's, let's face it, an older version of Conley. But then you watch Walker Kessler play, and you go, wait, did we just trade a younger version of the dude that we just traded for that would not have cost all these other things? So not to keep going on and on and on about the Timberwolves trade there, but a lot of this is TBD on a lot of the potential picks here for disappointing storylines. But Minnesota and what's happened with Gobert there, and seeing what Kessler looks like, and that he's a big that closes basketball games, like, wait a minute, that's still happening. That would certainly be in consideration for a pick, but not ahead of New Orleans. The LA teams are still kind of ... on this one. The Clippers had lost 5 straight at the end of February, March. They've won 5 of 6. They're at the 5 seed position. I swear to God, every time I think the Clippers will be lower in the standings, and I'm like, nope, they're not again. Like when they're losing, it feels like everybody else is losing. We know that everything's super congested in the West anyway. So despite the frustrations of who's there and who's not, it's been pretty good now for a while. It doesn't necessarily translate to wins, but they've been really good with Kawhi. Have you realized these numbers since the All-Star break? He's 36 and 3. He's 56 from the floor, 52% from 3, I think on 7 attempts per game. He's making all of his free throws again. So he has been on a tear. I think they know what their closing group is with the shooting that Eric Gordon provides. I know a lot of people are throwing around the Russell Westbrook fourth quarter numbers. You might want to hold off on throwing those around so early. That's just a heads up to you. But it seems like with all the options, which Ty Lue even admitted at times, like he was trying to figure out how to close. Remember that Sacramento ridiculous overtime stretch game there where it was in the 170s? He had said, like, yeah, I even kind of forgot about Terrence Mann at one point. So the Clippers thing, the only reason I would even suggest it is because when you mapped out putting together this roster, you figured, even with injury history here with Kawhi, you figured at the very least, like, we know we'll be in the mix. And it's mid-March, and I still don't know. On the other side, when it's not really across the street because he's playing the same building with the Lakers, they're the 11th seed today, but they're only half a game behind Utah. The problem is when you watch Utah play, they're coached well. They play really hard. They have a bunch of different options. Like, you have to kind of show up expecting to play against Utah, even if there could be some last-minute jockeying here with 10-plus games to go. Anthony Davis has been great. The post-All-Star numbers are really good. He's not making threes again this year or this month. He hasn't really made threes in about 4 years. So right when I said after that Memphis game when he kept falling down all the time and I thought he was going to be done for the year 3 separate times, I was like, I can't expect that it's all going to turn around. He's going to be terrific. We knew as soon as we said that he'd go on a nice run, and he's been on that run. D'Angelo Russell is almost statistically to the 10th the same exact guide statistically on a lot of the traditional stats that he was in Minnesota. But I think some of the bullshit stuff that drove me crazy with Minnesota, it's always going to be part of his game. I think he's been better. Maybe it's a bit of that new car smell early in the relationship where you're not letting the other person know all your secrets. It could be a bit of that. And he's making the free agency push. LeBron will come back. He is going to come back. So there's still a feeling that they could be really scary, but it probably has more to do with Anthony Davis being there every night and continuing to play this way before you would start being worried about playing him the first round. And it's just weird. We're going to have all these teams closing at the regular season going, who are they right now? And we just covered 3 or 4. Golden State. I can't tell if we're not as nasty about Golden State And I mean, it just feels like in general, because they won last year, right? Or should we be less nasty? What's happening this season? Like, they don't catch enough shit for how bad they are. The road thing, we keep bringing it up constantly. Like, how are they this bad on the road? Their defense on the road is 28th. They're only better than San Antonio and Houston. And by the way, every number that's really bad, that's ahead of a couple teams, it's either San Antonio, Houston, or Detroit that ranks last and all that stuff. Steph's missed 26 games. Wiggins has now missed 36. Who knows if he's even going to play again this season. Dre and Klay Thompson have played a really good chunk of the year. So it's not that. Poole has regressed, and I think all the lottery guys, whether it's moving on from Wiseman, Kuminga being a different guy every single night, Moody sometimes in the rotation, not being in the rotation, the fact that there's a couple G Leaguers in there that were taking up a good chunk of the minutes with Lamb and even Jerome at times. This is pretty disappointing, but maybe they avoid it because it felt like last year was, I wouldn't say a surprising title run, because if they were healthy, you're not going to write Curry off. And then I think that's still lingering with me. It's like, what if everything's kind of good the last week and then you go in and you're like, wait, we're playing the Warriors in the first round? So they're on the board, but I don't think they'd be one of the top 3 picks. All right, a couple more here and then we'll finish up. Memphis, since Steven Adams has gone out, that was January 23rd. It looks like he'll be reevaluated in less than 3 more than 2 weeks. Their offense, and this is the crazy thing, the defense has been 5th in the NBA since that time. The offense is only 26th, and they're 13-12 over that time. Now, having gone through all the stuff that they've gone through, and the jaw part of it being the latest, and he's apparently going to be back this Wednesday against Dallas, they're the 2 seed today. So we know that, disappointing seasons are graded more on the playoffs, but the jaw thing's in its own category altogether. Like, what does disappointing mean? Like, hey, what's going on with Russillo today? Oh, he's kind of bummed out. This jaw stuff's really getting to him. Really? Does he know him? No, he's never met him. Right? So, like, I'm not disappointed. I'm not waking up to go, man, I hope Ja figures it out, man. But he's probably going to come back, and because he's a young dude, and there could even be a little element of this being like, all right, I got fucking weird on a night. Like, I'm fine. I've explained it. Maybe people didn't like the explanation, but there's still no one in the league who can stay in front of me. So what's going to change there? I'm still going to get my 30 points, and we're going to start winning some games. And if they get Adams back, they'll be good. Bane's been terrific, and I think the best part offensively from Memphis is the Jaren Jackson thing, where he's taken more shots this month per game, about 15, than he has really throughout his career. He's usually kind of in that 11 to 13 shots per game throughout. He gets to the free throw line. I know the threes aren't necessarily there, but the scoring is. And look, his threes are fine. It's still a threat, still something that you have to defend. And I thought what he did against Golden State the other night was terrific, because Kuminga was giving him some problems, and then he realized, like, why am I even pretending? Like, let me just up fake Kuminga. Kuminga's young. He'll fall for it. And then he kept pressing, going, Golden State doesn't really have anything. So I thought that game was actually an indication of Jackson kind of understanding what was happening around him and then attacking that way. So you could sit there and say, hey, Memphis was supposed to be a real contender. Ja was supposed to be an MVP candidate and all these things, first team NBA. That all could very well still happen. So they're not ahead of what I think is my final picker, and that's Atlanta. Atlanta's an 8 seed today. They're 35-36. Last year, they finished the season 43-39, but they were at 36-37. They put together a nice stretch and won 7 of their last 9. If you look at the Quinn Snyder stuff here, 10 games into it, he's 4-6. The offense is 8th with Quinn. The defense is 28th. Before he got there, the offense was 11th. Since then, they were 21st. They're actually 5 points worse per 100 possessions. None of this is on Quinn Snyder at this point. Whatever he wants to do, and put it all in. I just think that Atlanta has a really nice roster, and they cannot figure this part out. I think Trey was trying to kind of step off the gas a bit in the first few that he had with Quinn. It could have just been the schedule. It could have been the night-to-night thing. He was 15 shots a game the first 4 games. Since then, he's gone 21 or more shots per game. He's had a couple absolute duds in there. But they're going to probably end up finishing up with a worse record than they did last year, and no one is going to pick them in the first round against any team in the playoffs. There are other options out there. Certainly, this list is not complete. But if I had to put them in order, it's a clear Pelicans number 1. Atlanta might be number 2. Yes, there's a Nets suggestion here. I think we've already done that Nets topic for like 3 years. Is the Gobert Minnesota package 3 because the Clipper stuff is incomplete. Let's put Golden State because it's still incomplete at number 4. And then I'd say the 5th most disappointing from this season is Dylan Brooks on a jersey swap.